after about 30 some years of advocacy, we would finally have some of our beautiful streets landmarked. So I'm going to show you some of those streets, okay? Of course, 4th Avenue has changed a lot. And this will show the major development of the neighborhood, because it was the Grand Boulevard that would bring people out of downtown Brooklyn, where you can see way in the distance the old Williamsburg Savings Bank building down by Atlantic Avenue and Flatbush and 4th Avenue. And then progressively, 4th Avenue would go all the way into the end of Bay Ridge, where you see the red brick towers way down there. That's the other, just before the end of the neighborhood, which would stop there at 65th Street. You can see a Gothic little church tower, and that was the old German Lutheran church, okay? You may have noticed there was a little tower of Gothic church way down by the Williamsburg Savings Bank. That was the old Polish church, Our Lady of Częstochowa. Different ethnic groups had settled the neighborhood. Basically, the neighborhood started as a beginning of a middle-class neighborhood, an outgrowth of Park Slope in the 1890s. But by the early 1900s, it would definitely become working class. And most of the housing built in the neighborhood was built in the period between the 1890s and the early 1900s, prior to World War I. So you have about 80–90% of that is working class housing. Some of the older streets were built as primarily a middle class, one family, and we'll talk about that and see those examples all along the way. Now, you have a picture already of St. Michael's. St. Michael's is a landmark in the sense of its architecture. It is not an official landmark of the city of New York. We're going to be talking about landmarks today in Sunset Park. Some of the individual ones, and then the several streets that have become landmarked in the last couple of years. The church tower is a magnificent 200-foot tower with that beehive-type dome that looks like the Sacré-Cœur in Montmartre in Paris. Actually, Raymond Almiral had gone to the École des Beaux-Arts, the architect, probably inspired by these Romanesque Byzantine-style churches that were in Paris at the time, and the church was built basically for an Irish congregation, but now it's mostly Hispanic here in the neighborhood. Church 1905, unusual because the bell tower is the church entrance rather than being the campanile on the side. And if you see those protrusion bumps out on the top of the tower, that's when they added the cell phones. They could do that because it wasn't a landmark. Anyway, the church also would build a school in 1910. Some beautiful, again, terracotta details on St. Michael's School. I went to St. Michael's High School, which was the next building and couple of buildings down below back in the 1950s. This is my old neighborhood. Welcome to my old neighborhood. I grew up here in the 1940s and 50s when it was a quiet, very easygoing neighborhood. We could play stickball on the streets without any cars. We could leave the doors open at night and not worry about anything happening. We had individual landmarks in the neighborhood. The one behind me over here with the scaffolding is the old 62nd Police Precinct station, and it was a landmark that was built in the 1890s. As the neighborhood was being developed, the city put in the big police precinct to establish safety in the neighborhood. And next to it, where the empty lot is now, used to be the carriage house, the stable for the horses back then. It was a complex of buildings built by the city of Brooklyn. City of Brooklyn was a separate city till 1898, extended as far south as about 65th Street today. So this neighborhood would be developed in the 1890s, first starting out as a mini version of the middle-class neighborhood of Park Slope, which is well over a mile further to the north over here. And by the early 1900s, with industry along the waterfront, it would turn into a working-class neighborhood. So the police precinct, done in this, you can't see much of the detail of it now, in this sort of Romanesque, Byzantine, Norman, Venetian style, a lot of beautiful details in terracotta, is being readapted with just saving the facade for a new school facility. Schools are a problem here because there's so many of the families, immigrant families, with children that are not, then there are not enough school buildings, so always looking to build more school facilities. Further down the avenue is a senior residence that was part originally of the old Lutheran Medical Center, which was the old Norwegian hospital. And further down the block are a couple of the old Norwegian churches and the old German Lutheran Church. Down the other end of the block of 4th Avenue, going the other direction, you had on 27th Street up the block, you had the Italian St. Rocco's Parish, and on 24th Street, Our Lady of Częstochowa, the Polish parish. And there was a Greek up on 18th Street, there was a Greek church and a Greek school. So what happened originally, the neighborhood was originally going to be middle class, with the industry coming on the waterfront in the early 1900s. It became working class, and all the different ethnic groups coming out of downtown Brooklyn. In particular, there were Irish and Germans here first, and then they were followed by the Scandinavians coming out of Red Hook and the Gowanus area, moving further south. This became a very, very heavy Scandinavian neighborhood. Mostly Norwegians, the Finns I'll talk about when we get up in the park, and then also the Swedes and the Danes. Then they'd be followed by the Polish and the Italians, and then by the 1940s, the neighborhood started to take a Hispanic immigration, beginning with the Puerto Ricans coming in to work in the war industries on the waterfront. And by 20 years later, it became quite a lot of Dominican people living in the neighborhood. And then afterwards, many other Hispanic people. You had Ecuadorians, Salvadorians, Nicaraguans, and by the 1990s, early 2000s, this is starting to become quite a bit of a Mexican neighborhood, and it is today quite a bit of a Hispanic mixed neighborhood, where it started out basically with the Puerto Ricans, and now it is basically a lot of the Mexicans that have the stores on the avenue. We'll see some of that on our walk. Anyway, that's one of the individual landmarks. We couldn't save the whole thing because the school authority supersedes a landmark law, so they could take the building and redo it or tear it down. I guess we're lucky enough that we have just that corner facade left to identify what was the great old police precinct back in the 1890s. Now, 4th Avenue, this boulevard that you see here, was the Grand Boulevard because it didn't have many commercial buildings. It had civic buildings like the churches and the police precinct and the hospital and the courthouse, which is behind us, that you'll get a picture of in a moment. But the boulevard, looking like what's on this brochure that was done by the Sunset Park Restoration Committee about the history of the neighborhood, you can see there is a planted mall here in the center, where now the grading is for the subway. Subway didn't start to get dug until 1909 and opened in 1915, but originally this was a grand boulevard with planted trees and shrubs and such before it became this kind of major car thoroughfare. The sidewalks, you see, are very wide as they are today, but they even used to be wider. The sidewalks extended out to here originally. So it was basically a much wider for promenading when you're going to church and such, because the major traffic would happen on 3rd Avenue, the block below where the elevated train ran already in the 1890s, or on 5th Avenue where the trolley cars would run in the 1890s, and that became the commercial centers, 3rd and 5th, and this was the Grand Promenade of 4th Avenue in the middle. Of course, 4th Avenue has changed a lot. So I'm going to take you up into the park and up a lovely street, which is not a landmark street, but really should be at some point. Okay? Yeah, hi, I just want to mention the courthouse is another individual landmark. It's the Magistrates Court, and it consists of 2 great courtrooms on the upper floors and then administrative offices, and it would extend to the next block to 43rd Street. It's done in a wonderful neoclassic style with the Ionic columns. So it's one of the few individual landmarks before we got our landmark designation for about a dozen or so streets that I'm going to take you for a walk on now. This street looking up the block, the beautiful rhythm of the brownstones with the parlor floor and basement style houses, the high stoop outside, is not a landmark block. And we believe it should be a landmark block because it has two landmarks at the base of it, as well as the main entrance to Sunset Park right above it. This street, along with the next three streets, have contiguous row houses of working class, mostly a design. A nice street on 41st Street has some unusual working class houses, and then there are some wonderful six-family apartments, again of another very unusual style, on 40th Street. So if you took these four streets from 43rd to 40th, from 4th to 5th Avenue, they would constitute another fifth landmark section of Sunset Park, and we hope at some point that that will happen because it represents in this area not only the beautiful contiguous street as you see above here, but also it contains two different types of working class houses that are not represented in the other parts of Sunset Park, and the Landmarks Commission very wisely tried to do as many different styles of working class housing in Sunset Park, but there's still two more types that should be included, and they're in this neighborhood further here to the north. Okay, we're going to go up the block and we're going to go into Sunset Park for some fantastic views. We originally had National Register District for over 3,300 buildings. Finally, under landmarking, we'd only get about 16% of them. About 539 buildings became landmarked. So we'll see what happens in the future. It takes a lot of community activism and work to get this all done, of course. What we're looking at, this street, and the next block above that we'll also see when we get further up there, is one of the four landmark districts that were designated over a year ago. This is called Sunset Park North, consisting of these 1908 row houses, the apartment buildings up here near 6th Avenue, and then the other street of two-family working class houses that we'll see when we get further up the block. So this is Sunset Park North Landmark District, this one block from 5th Avenue to 7th Avenue. And you see the beautiful details in the brickwork, the patterned brickwork, and also the entranceways with their wonderful cast iron and leaded glass canopies. Inside there's marble and stained glass in the hallways, built with beautiful details and woodwork inside, and of course magnificent views overlooking the park and the city for some of them. They became co-ops because of the Finns in the neighborhood. The Finns were very hard-working people, and a lot of them could not afford to buy individual houses. So what they did is they formed association and they bought buildings or had buildings built as co-ops. Co-op story is very interesting. I'll get into that in a moment. But looking down the block, below the apartment houses, you have this wonderful line of 1908 limestone with brownstone bases with those high brownstone stoops. They're called parlor floor and basement style houses. The basement is the walk-in. There is a full cellar below, and then there are two floors above, the parlor floor, and then the top floor would have normally been the bedrooms of a modest one-family house. But by the time of 1908, when these were built, the neighborhood had become working class, so they look like one family, but they were really built as two-family with an upstairs top floor apartment where the owner usually had a lower duplex. And over time, sometimes these houses like this would be turned into rooming houses or floor-through apartments, and some cases, even if the people could afford to in today's world, be turned back into, one or two family houses. Anyway, we're going to go up into the park, and I'll talk about the Finns and such when we get up into the park. I want to tell you about the park. It's a wonderful addition to the city. Sunset Park, the park itself from which the neighborhood, Old Bay Ridge, This was the Sunset Park neighborhood of Bay Ridge before it officially got the designation as the neighborhood name Sunset Park. It was part of the old city of Brooklyn. City of Brooklyn is developing south and east and such, and the borders of the old city of Brooklyn till 1898, when it became consolidated with the rest to become Greater New York, was 65th Street. We're on 44th Street over here now. So this whole area south of Greenwood Cemetery, south of Park Slope, was ripe for development in the 1890s. And the city of Brooklyn did a very smart thing. They designated an area for a park before all this major development would happen. And the park is 24.5 acres. And it extended from 5th Avenue up to 7th Avenue, from 41st Street to 44th Street. So it has many wonderful areas that have been changed over time, of course, with use, in the 1930s and 40s, with the play fields being put in. But it was more one of those rural kind of landscape parks, just like you had Fort Greene Park, which was the first park of Brooklyn in the 1840s. Other neighborhoods that were being developed later, like going further east, like Tompkins Park and such. Sunset Park would become the major regional park for this part of South Brooklyn. And by the 1930s, Robert Moses would do an improvement to the park. He would put in the Sunset Park pool in 1936 with that wonderful Art Deco tile that you can see there with that green maple leaf logo of the Parks Department is. It's the Sunset Park Play Center. A lot of community activities there, and it is a landmark. If you go into the rotunda of it, it's a little mini version of Art Deco, so it's a wonderful individual landmark. The part of the landmark district of the North Sunset Park is the street over here that I'm pointing to over here. You'll see the wonderful row of two-family brick houses. Very simple neoclassic style, built in 1903 for that working class people that would come in because of the development of the waterfront industries. The waterfront industries coming out of the basins around Gowanus and Red Hook would be moving further south. By 1903, Irving Bush would develop Bush Terminal, about 16 buildings on 35 acres, and now it's called Industry City. And it's like a much larger version of the Chelsea market with a lot of artisanal businesses and shops and wonderful spaces for the arts and crafts and entertainment and small industry. So this is a working class neighborhood now, and there are many streets of these two-family style buildings. They all have backyards to them. So this is the way the immigrant families first got a wonderful way, which is what happened with my family when they came to the neighborhood in 1927 from Lower Manhattan. They would buy a two-family house. They'd have an apartment which would be for themselves and another one for rental income. Usually other family members would be living there with them. The basement is not a high basement like you saw where the high stoops were on the other part of the landmark area further down. They had basements, though, with windows. So you could actually have a lot of extra room for workshop, entertainment, besides all your utilities. Then there was a backyard, and the backyard usually was about 30 or 40 feet. And the backyard of this street to the backyard of the next street meant you had about 80 or 90 feet of open space in the middle of these blocks, where we used to have all of our rose bushes and peach trees and vegetables and grass or whatever. So there was a nice way of working class people being able to afford to live in the neighborhood. Then by about 1914 or so, instead of building these two-family brick houses, they would build the apartment buildings, usually fourth-floor walk-ups. And in the case of like the apartments that I'm pointing to right across the way, they were more or less owned by a family or people who the owner lived in the building until later on when there were problems and people moved out of the neighborhood because of drugs and other economic factors. And then they became abandoned. These buildings were actually burn-out abandoned buildings. and they would be renovated by the 1970s and 80s with various government programs for affordable housing under Section 8, where the tenants would get a new apartment and they'd be only paying 1/3 of their monthly income. So there were about 550 of these apartments that were renovated from all the burnt out buildings that were in Sunset Park. But what saved Sunset Park to not be like the South Bronx or Bushwick or such was that there weren't that many of the 4-story apartment buildings. Most of them were smaller 2, 3 family, 4 family residences that were owner occupied. So that architecture kind of saved the neighborhood from really becoming totally abandoned like you had in the other parts of the city where there were more just high-rise, multi-family 4, 5, 6-story buildings. The buildings that I pointed out before that were the beautiful brickwork with the co-ops, they never had any problems because they were owner occupied by the Co-op Association. And the Co-op Association were mostly the Finns that had started this co-op reform movement. In the early 1900s, they started with 2 buildings in 1916 on 43rd Street below 8th Avenue. But by the 1930, before the Depression, they had about 50 of these self-managed co-ops. And they were very democratic because everyone had an equal vote. They didn't have shares. They had an equal representation whether they had one large studio or a 2-bedroom apartment. They were all equal in terms of being able to vote on what to do with their building. So they weren't organized like under the Department of State. They were organized under the Department of Agriculture, just like an agricultural co-op. No matter what size your farm was, you still had an equal vote. Very democratic. More of these have now, I'm sure all of them have turned now into the regular co-op with the shares and such, and the proportionment for shares for voting and such. But that was a very democratic way the Finns were able to live decently together, and they all worked on the buildings together. They all took care of the buildings and fixed them up. I remember I had a co-op in a building on 41st Street, and we had a work day every couple of months where we would do painting in the hallways, repair the sidewalk, fix the roof, and the older people, like the older women, would make us lunch and clean the hallways and wash the windows in the halls, and every floor had to be maintained by the people on that floor as far as cleaning the floor in the co-op. So they didn't have a big problem with running them, and they were very low maintenances. You can imagine back in the 1980s and such, these apartments were going for the equivalent of about $20,000 or $30,000 per room, and the maintenances were like about $25 or so per room. So it was very equitable, but today now they're in the few hundred thousands and such. But this was affordable working class housing. And those 4 buildings with the beautiful brickwork were originally those old Scandinavian Finnish co-ops. The Finns came here in the early 1900s, the industry along the waterfront. The neighborhood was primarily Norwegian, but Finns came with them, and they lived on this part of the eastern part of the park. And they called it Pukenmaki, Goat Hill, because there were goats grazing on the cut between this terminal moraine of the Ice Age, between the high point here in Sunset Park and the high point to the north in Greenwood Cemetery. They had 2 churches, they had a meeting hall, they had a Finnish newspaper, they had a Finnish co-op garage, which still exists as a co-op garage. They were very communal. I think that's a good example of how today, if we can't afford to buy an individual property ourselves, we should make our own co-ops and buy buildings and live together in a cooperative way. Anyway, we're going to continue now from the park, and we're going to go down and look at the next landmark neighborhood. Welcome to 47th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue. This block, along with the next block, 48th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue, and the brownstone limestone houses up on 6th Avenue in the shape of a U form the Sunset Park Central Landmark District. This is one of the 4. This is the second of the 4 that we're looking at now. And this block is very unique because it has your basic brownstones across the way, done in the early 1900s, built as two-family houses. But it has this wonderful row here on the south side of the block of 25 houses that each house is different. Has different details, different treatments of the doorways, of the banding, of the different styles of bands between the windows. And it's surrounded, they're either round bays or they're angled bays. They're either brownstone or limestone. And there are a couple even further down that are flat-fronted houses. Very rhythmic about all these different styles on one block. It was designed between 1897 and 1899 by one architect, Thomas Bennett. Thomas Bennett did hundreds of row houses here in the Sunset Park neighborhood, including the one street that we had seen by the park of the limestone and the brownstones. So we're going to walk down the block and stop by the bottom pair of flat-fronted houses. Just enjoy all the different variety of architectural details as we proceed down the block. This is one of the few original front gardens. Every house had a front garden originally. You're looking at an 1898 limestone, one of the 25 houses that have all the individual features, each one different than the other. That's the La Brea limestone on the house with the beautiful stained glass fan windows over the parlor. Built as a one family, 1898. The first owner of the house was a Rose Duras. We had to do research when we were doing National Register back in 1988. And the house was owned by Rose Duras. Nobody knew who Rose Duras was, except a friend of mine, librarian, said, hey, that was Marion Davies' mother. Marion Davies was the silent movie star and the mistress of William Randolph Hearst. We have a very illustrious person coming out, standing in front of her wonderful house. This is Lynn Massimo. She and Lynn Tondrick, her partner, started the Sunset Park Landmarks Committee, and with the help of the Historic Districts Council, they were the ones that were the movers and shakers with the community people to get our landmarks that we have. So we're doing a landmarks tour, and I'd give you a big hug if I could. And so it's so wonderful to see you.
In 2013, we became an HDC 6 to celebrate. And the HDC took us under their wing, and we didn't know anything, and they taught us everything, and we put it to work. It took a long time, and 7 years later, we became designated 4 historic districts in Sunset Park.
I just want to welcome you to another landmark district in Sunset Park. Very special. It's just called the 50th Street Landmark District because it's comprised of 25 houses on each side of the street between 5th and 4th Avenue that were built between 1897-99. And these were all built as one-family houses when this was still that aspiring middle-class neighborhood. And it was a lot of this was like Doctors Row because the old Norwegian hospital was down on 47th Street and 4th Avenue, which would later on become Lutheran Medical Center. Beautiful interior details of oak and mahogany and cherry wood and such. And I owned this house, 465, back in 1977 when the conditions, the social conditions and the problems with lack of city services were in the neighborhood. It was a one-family original when I bought it. And I don't know if it's been turned now into a 2 or whatever, but it's indicative of the grand style of these brownstones with these beautiful front stoops that don't even bring you right out into the sidewalk. They turn so that elegantly you can stand here on this little platform, look out over the street, and then you can also enter into your areaway. Your areaway originally had a lot of front gardens. You'll still see some front gardens on this street. So the houses basically were designed, the top 10 by a Henry Spicer, and the rest of the balance of the block and across the street were done by a Thomas Bennett, our architect Thomas Bennett, whom I've talked about already, the houses on 47th Street and also on 44th Street. So magnificent row with beautiful, this sort of neoclassic and Renaissance Revival details. You'll see the wonderful door with the bronze snake-like handles on the door. These houses, some of them, are loaded with beautiful woodwork. Mantelpieces and pier mirrors and room dividers and parquet floors and such. Welcome to our fourth landmark district of the four we're looking at today. This is Sunset Park South. Starting here on 54th Street, going as far as 59th Street, mostly all of the streets between 4th Avenue and 5th Avenue are part of this large landmark district that was one of the four that was designated a year ago. And you can see why we need designation. When you look up the block and see the wonderful 2-3-story buildings, and you can see what can happen to these buildings if they're not landmarked. Like the building over here that I'm pointing to has an addition on the top of it. So fortunately, it is not in the landmark district, because this was done before landmarking. But anything like that could have happened to any of these other houses if we weren't landmarked. And that was the impetus of the Sunset Park Landmarks Committee to say, we can't have all these inappropriate additions. This is not affordable housing that's going on. This is market rate housing, and it doesn't look appropriate to what the neighborhood should be for light, air, and density and city services. So you're going to see a row on both sides of the street of houses that were basically built between anywhere from the 1890s through the early 1900s. Some of them still have their original front gardens. You'll notice there are several different styles as we go. As builders and developers got different pieces of property, they would build 4, 5, 2, 3, 1, whatever of that type of house. Basically, they're all neoclassic or Romanesque revival or Renaissance revival or neo-Grec. And you'll notice the wonderful brickwork on these houses. Even the corners of the brick are not angled, they're rounded brick. It's very, very, expensive brickwork that's done here. And a lot of the houses still have some of the original ironwork rather than this new garish replacement that you can see. So we're going to continue up the block, enjoy the details of the block as we proceed. Before the Sunset Park Landmarks Committee, there was a Sunset Park Restoration Committee. And the Sunset Park Restoration Committee did so many wonderful things, including this beautiful book that was written by Alice Walsh. And Robert Walsh, her husband, yes. They had done a lot of research on all the facilities of the neighborhood. And Alice and Bob moved here in what, 72?
73.
In 73, 1973. Alice is still here. And her daughter was living upstairs. So it's a family house that's been maintained for decades already, which is what the neighborhood is about, that stability. All of this is part of what stabilized the community and prevented the developers from doing what they did to the last of the row houses down on the bottom of the block, putting that extra floor on top of it, which is very inappropriate. So
We were married, we wanted to buy a house, and this was the only neighborhood we could afford. And we looked for a fixer-upper, and we found it on this block. And so we had a lot of work to do, but we did most of it ourselves because we couldn't afford to hire people. And then gradually other folks like us moved in, young couples, with a minimal budget. And then we'd get together and kind of think about, planting trees on the block, and maybe having a block party, and maybe we could do something at the library. And so it just grew, and then we decided to form a committee, and then we had homeowner workshops, and we charged $5 for a series of 6 workshops so that we could get some money for our treasury because we didn't want to charge dues. And
we did house tours.
And we did house tours, and we made a movie, and then we wrote that book. And so it was really wonderful because we got to know people from the neighborhood. So it felt like a community, small town, and had activities and events in the park for the kids. And yeah, it was just a very exciting time, 1970s, I'd say, through the late 1980s. And
about a 15-year period, the
Yeah,
Landmarks
yeah,
Committee would
yeah.
meet about once a month, and usually we met in that German Lutheran church in their hall in the basement down on 4th Avenue. And we had concerts there and family dinners and so forth. So it was very much about community involvement and people getting to know each other and just having fun and enjoying living here, right? We did dances and flea markets and all sorts of good things. And we're still friends.
Yeah, and a lot of people have moved on, but then there are folks who've stayed as well, and there's that connection. And then, of course, when the Landmarks Committee got started, so there was a base for them to
Yes.
work from.
The National Register.
It
Yeah.
was a network of folks who were still in the neighborhood, and then Joe, of course, had worked hard on the National Register, and so it was fortuitous, I guess.
Oh,
right?
it was a wonderful experience about learning about community and living in our city and enjoying our beautiful streets and our homes.
But for here in Sunset Park, it was a 40-year process.
Yes.
Because it
We were poor. Yeah.
politically not a strong representation, and different factors, and lower working class population. So there were a lot of things going against it as opposed to for it. But a lot of wonderful people that make up the fabric of the neighborhood. Good people and good neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a sense of big city living, but kind of in a small town feel. So that's why I'm still here. and I haven't left, so, and I think that's the big attraction. Because especially in the pandemic, we had neighbors that came out 7 o'clock every night for the first 2 months and played music, and everybody joined them and banged our pots, and it was very uplifting, and it got us through the worst of times.
Mm-hmm.
It went from the middle of March
Sure.
to the middle of April.
Sure.
And neighbors checking in on each other to see how they were doing. Did they need anything? Just, how are you? Are you okay? So
Right.
that's what makes
Right.
Sunset Park, 54th Street very special.
This is one of the fine blocks in Sunset Park, part of that Sunset Park South District that comprises the blocks between 54th and 59th Street. We're on 55th Street now. You see some again of those wonderful Renaissance Revival, neoclassic looking houses with the high stoops. You've seen some of the beautiful details and some of the ironwork on the entrances and also the doorways and such. And it was built again for a middle class, this type of architecture on this block, that then would be turned into 2-family, 3-family, or maybe rooming houses, and now being restored again. So it's a wonderful way of preserving the architectural quality of these rows of houses as they march up and down the street on our hill, which makes this neighborhood so special, the hill that we have. We're going to continue down the block. We're going to do one more block back up to 5th Avenue, and then we will end the tour, okay? We're looking at the only mansion that was built in Sunset Park, here on 4th Avenue at the bottom of the 55th Street block that we just had taken a look at. It was designed in 1908 by Hardy and Short. They were architects for very wealthy people, and it was originally a mansion built for a doctor, and I think at one time president of the Bay Ridge Savings Bank up on 5th Avenue. It has that neoclassic portico entrance with a Palladian-style window and balcony over the entranceway, and it has some beautiful stained glass on the hallway on the other side, on the back side. I don't know about the interior details, but you can see the lovely proportions of the house, and also it had a carriage house off on the left, which has been sort of remodeled, I would say. But the basic house itself was landmarked as an individual landmark because it was threatened to be torn down and redeveloped as a much larger scale building. So it's been preserved. I don't know what the future of it is going to be, though. Across the street behind the tree with the lovely Gothic tower, that's the St. Jacobi Evangelical Lutheran Church, the German Lutheran Church, from about 1908. And now it's Chinese and Hispanic as far as the Lutheran congregation is. So changing with the ethnicity of the neighborhood, but not part of the landmark district. We've come from 54th Street now to 59th Street, and all the blocks in between 4th and 5th Avenue are part of this Sunset Park South District. It's the largest of the 4 districts in Sunset Park since it comprises several streets. And this is an unusual block, this north side of 59th Street, because as you see, they are flat-fronted houses, not with the projected bays. And they have some unusual detail between the buildings. In terracotta, you can see that kind of rope molding defining the different houses. There's also wonderful marble steps going up, and then beautiful iron spot brickwork. You see a lot of beautiful brickwork in Sunset Park, that iron spot rather than the red brick which flakes off. This is a very hard-fired brick. It's basically probably a Kreischer brick, which was done a lot in the 1890s, early 1900s on row houses in Brooklyn. And this was designed by one architect, Henry Spicer, in 1895, again, as a one-family style of house, probably converted into 2 or 3 along the way. So we're going to go up to 5th Avenue now, take a look at the largest religious building on Long Island, and then end the tour. Yeah, you're looking at the same style of house, but they're varying the colors of the brick from light and dark, so it has kind of a rhythm to it. And you see some of the beautiful original ironwork still in front of a couple of these houses. You're looking at the grandest church of all. I pointed out several churches on our walk. This is the largest church on Long Island, the whole of Long Island. This is Our Lady of Perpetual Help Basilica, or as we used to say for short, OLPH, or for us kids in school, oh, let's play hooky. Anyway, we couldn't. The nuns were very strict. And the church was built as a small country church back in the 1890s at the end of the trolley line. And then the church, by the early 1900s, would develop into this much larger basilica form, because the church was now servicing over 25,000 Catholic people in this parish. A very large parish, mostly Irish, and then of course Italian and Polish and other ethnic groups. Now it's mostly Hispanic, and you can see the sign that's beeping over there that'll have mass that tells you in Mandarin and in Filipino and Vietnamese and other different languages to, meet the ethnic needs of the community which is here now. We're going to cross, we're going to look at some of the more details of the building as we get across the street. It's what the upper sanctuary looks like. It's over about 1,200 people that can be seated up there. It was made a basilica a few decades ago when the bishop, who couldn't have as much of a large church where St. James is, the Cathedral of Brooklyn, downtown Brooklyn on J Street, he would come out here to use the facilities of the great Our Lady of Perpetual Help Church. It's a lower church and an upper church, and each seats about 1,200 people. And in my day, there were 25,000 parishioners at this church, so they'd have Mass every half hour from like 6:30 in the morning until 12:30, 1 o'clock in the afternoon to meet the needs of their 20-some thousand parishioners when everybody used to go to church. And when we were in the 4th grade of grammar school, we used to have 5th grade to the 8th grade. We used to go to Mass here at 7:30 in the morning, go home and have breakfast, and then go to school down the block. So this is the church that very much was in my family. That was their neighborhood parish when they moved out of Lower Manhattan. And they came here in 1927 to 57th Street, just a couple blocks away. And my mother and father were married in this church in 1937. So I was baptized in this church, went to grammar school here. And matter of fact, mentioning the size of the church, and the size of the church meant that there were many students in school. This is my 8th grade class of 75 boys. There were 75 of us, 13 years old, in class with one nun. The girls had their own class of 70-some girls on the other side of the building at that time. So quite a story about how we learned from each other and how we were disciplined by the nuns that nobody dared act out. And the nun that we had in the 8th grade was known as Tough Tessie, Sister Teresa Carmel. She was an ex-policewoman on the narcotics squad before she became a nun, and very appropriate to take control of a class of 75 13-year-old boys and get us everyone into high school. We dared not go home and tell Mother that the nun had to reprimand us because we were supposed to be very good children in those days, okay? And the nuns had total control. But anyhow, it's a neighborhood parish. It's a large building. It's not landmarked. But Brooklyn is a city of churches, and this is the largest one of them all. If you're taking the Staten Island ferry, you can see it on the hill from on the ferry, as well as what you could see the Tower of St. Michael's where we first started. So we started with a church and we end with a church, and that's all about neighborhood. And we've been able to talk to and visit with some of my old neighbors, so I hope that this is a good way of understanding of what community is all about from beginning to end of my 70-some years of involvement with the Sunset Park neighborhood. So I hope you enjoyed the tour. I've enjoyed giving it to you and seeing and meeting some of my old neighbors along the way.